Bob Ferguson's own task force that he created as Attorney General, that's run through the Attorney General's office, which he is the Attorney General for 2 more days, has actually determined that Bob Ferguson himself is engaged in extremism. By their own work, by their own definitions, Bob Ferguson, the governor-elect of Washington State, who championed the hate crime hotline, who championed the domestic violent extremism and mass violence task force, is himself an extremist. Let me discuss. First, a little precursor for those of you who aren't familiar with this. So, Washington State, under Attorney General Bob Ferguson, wants to focus on domestic violent extremism and acts of mass violence. This is something that was championed by Bob Ferguson, 3-term Attorney General. 2 days from now, he's going to be sworn in as our next governor. So, the task force, to me, goes hand in hand with a hate crime hotline that was set up by Bob Ferguson's office. I think the goal here is to vilify conservatives, is to find ways to restrict speech, and is to artificially inflate hate crime numbers so they can justify continuing to spend taxpayer money on some of these things, like the Domestic Extremism Task Force. Now, the task force first met about a month ago. I think it was before the holiday break. And at the time, I said this thing's a farce. Because if 90% of a task force meeting about extremism in Washington isn't about the far left, then you can't be taken seriously. Then you actually don't want to get to the bottom of extremism in Washington State, because it's not even debatable. The vast majority of acts of extremism in Washington State are perpetrated by far left anarchists. That has been the case for 20 plus years. Have there been here and there instances of right-wing, far-right, white nationalism issues in Washington State? Sure. But they're not the ones lighting police cars on fire in broad daylight in downtown Seattle with cameras rolling. They're not the ones taking over 6 square blocks of the city and patrolling it with AR rifles that were handed to random people out of the trunk of a car. They're not the ones assaulting police officers and journalists. They're not the ones who are firebombing a police precinct again in broad daylight. They're not the ones who over and over and over repeatedly terrorize downtown Seattle with riots. It's not even a question. I'm not debating it with anyone. I'm not debating it with the members of the task force. I'm not debating it with Bob Ferguson and his office. The vast amount of domestic extremism, acts of extremism in Washington State is perpetrated by the left. That's a fact. Yet this task force, we already knew through their first meeting, was going to be almost exclusively focused on right-wing, white supremacist, and police violence. And we knew that because it was stacked. Even before listening to the first task force meeting, I could have told you that, based on the people who were put on the task force. A bunch of left-wing, anti-cop, anti-white ideologues. And one of the first indicators, I already played this after the first meeting, but I'm just going to play it again because I had to sit through it, so I want you to sit through too. I love you, but if I had to deal with this, you have to deal with it too. One of the first indicators that this task force can't be taken seriously is that nearly every single member, you want to try to convince me that this isn't full of ideologues? Nearly every single member, completely unprompted, at the task force meeting on Friday, introduced themselves thusly.
As I call on you, just please give us your name and organization.
I'm Mercedes Sanchez. I'm the executive director of Cedar River Clinics, and I use she, her pronouns.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adriana Suluai. I use she, her pronouns.
Good morning, everyone. Amber Wynn, she, her pronouns.
Good morning. My name is Emily Kaufman. I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, good morning. This is Carl Eastland. I'm the CEO for Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington and North Idaho. I use he, him pronouns, and I am based in Spokane.
Hi, good morning. Sharon Navas, she, her, Sharon.
Hi, my name is Karen Stromgren, she, her pronouns.
My name is Kira Kazanjian. I use she, her pronouns.
I'm the executive director of the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, and I use she, her pronouns.
Good God. And they weren't asked to give them their pronouns. They were asked to introduce themselves with their names and organization. And they all went into that, and they didn't even need to because on their Zoom, their name says their name and then she, her, he, him. And again, like you want to ask people to call you by whatever pronoun tickles your fancy, fine. But it is absolutely an indicator that this is full of left-wing ideologues. I would feel the same way if you turned on the screen and all the Zoom members were wearing masks. So it's just an indicator that if this isn't some sort of ideologically balanced group of people. So there are a couple things out of this second task force meeting that I want to hone in on today. And we're going to talk more about this week for reasons that will become clear later on. So it became very apparent. So the whole left, they're just ignoring left-wing violence. So it can't be taken seriously. They're not interested in solving the issue because they are going to ignore 90% of the causation, right? But the new issue that became incredibly disturbing in this second meeting is that this Extremism Task Force wants to suppress the media and suppress free speech. So it's like a 2.5-hour meeting. 20 minutes go by of these introductions with pronouns and all of these things and blah, 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 before they even get to discussing anything relevant to the task force. But about 20 minutes in, before they start their presentations and their discussions, the woman who's moderating the sort of meeting, she reminds members of the task force that they have a code of conduct that they must abide by. And she issued them in particular this reminder.
If you are contacted by press, that means a reporter, blogger, any member of the public inquiring about this task force, please contact me or another AGO staffer before responding to any request. Second, we ask that you do not make any statements or act on behalf of the task force independently. All statements should be made in coordination with the AGO staffing team. We have a communications team that can help assist and streamline these requests.
So you have a task force being funded with our money that is full of people who we're supposed to believe are there to think independently and critically about the issue and bring whatever their expertise is, whether they're an academic or part of an organization. And they're being explicitly told through their code of conduct, you are not to speak with anyone about this task force, despite the fact that the task force meetings are public. So if I were to, or a member of the media were to contact them and ask them questions about the task force, they are not to, by a code of conduct they're required to sign to be on the task force, they are not to speak to the media about what's happening on the task force. All of those requests, they're to immediately alert the Office of the Attorney General, who is, for the next 2 days, Bob Ferguson. That's insane. Oh, and it only gets worse. So I'm going to revisit this whole suppression of speech and the First Amendment and free press thing in a second. So finally, after 20 odd minutes, the content of the meeting actually gets started. And this woman, she's there in an academic capacity. She's presenting, okay, like let's start with, it's kind of funny that at this stage, 2 meetings in, they're still talking about, oh, what's the definition of extremism? It's like, shouldn't you cover that in the first meeting? We all know why we're here. But anyway, this academic shares what will be their working definition for what extremism is.
So I want to start with just the way that the field generally defines extremism. There's sort of 2 competing definitions of extremism. Most people, I think, have moved to this definition that a scholar named J.M. Berger has put forward that says it's a way of thinking that pits us versus them in existential terms so that the other group is seen as a sort of dire threat to one's own way of life and future survival in ways that ultimately mobilize violence.
Huh. A way of thinking that pits us versus them in existential terms. Does that sound familiar to you? Sounded familiar to us.
Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic.
Seems to fit the bill, right? Let's listen to that definition of extremism again.
It's a way of thinking that pits us versus them in existential terms so that the other group is seen as a sort of dire threat to one's own way of life and future survival in ways that ultimately mobilize violence.
Huh. So that the other side is seen as a dire threat, an existential threat to our survival in a way that mobilizes violence. Again, it sounds very familiar to us.
You called your opponent an existential threat. On a call a week ago, you said it's time to put Trump in the bullseye.
The exact definition that this academic is saying for extremism fits almost perfectly with all the statements made about Donald Trump being an existential threat to our country, statements that very well could have led to the assassination attempts on the now president-elect.
It's a way of thinking that pits us versus them in existential terms, so that the other group is seen as a sort of dire threat to one's own way of life and future survival in ways that ultimately mobilize violence.
A way of thinking that pits us versus them in existential terms. Now let's go to comments made by our governor-elect and our current Attorney General, Bob Ferguson. You'll probably remember this one. Donald Trump is an existential threat to our democracy, our American values, and reproductive freedom. I have experience taking him on and stopping his illegal, cruel, and un-American policies. Donald Trump is an existential threat to our democracy, our American values, and reproductive freedom. Does that not very perfectly line up with the definition of extremism being used by his own domestic violent extremism task force, a way of thinking that pits us versus them in existential terms, so that the other group is seen as posing a dire threat to one's way of life and future survival? It is exactly what Bob Ferguson has engaged in. It is exactly what the Democratic Party has engaged in when it comes to President-elect Donald Trump. And because of that, so I would just know, pretty rich, right? That Bob Ferguson has been outed by his own domestic violent extremism task force as engaging in extremist behavior. So I'm sitting there listening to this Friday morning, and I'm on the Zoom, and there's a, Zoom has a little area where it says question and answer. So you've got all the panelists, then you've got people who are watching as members of the public, and it allows you to type in questions. So for this academic, I typed in this question. I said, would that include individuals who call Donald Trump an existential threat to our democracy? By this definition, that would seem to fit the extremism mold, would it not? Right? So I'm noticing that as she's talking, despite the fact they ignore anything involving left-wing extremism at all on this task force, I'm noticing that exact thing. Like, that's exactly what they did to Donald Trump. That's exactly what Bob Ferguson did when he said, and what he said about Donald Trump. So I asked that question in the chat. And so this academic is getting to the end of her part of the presentation, and she opens it up to questions, and she notices the question that I put in the chat and seems as if she's going to start answering it. Here's what happened.
So I'm going to stop talking there. I've been talking for about a half hour, and I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. I will stop sharing so that I can see you. And if there are no questions right now, we can move on with the agenda, and I'm happy to be available. I mean, we can come back to it later on right now, but happy to discuss any questions or points of confusion about that. I see there are actually a couple of questions.
Actually, Cynthia, we if you're looking at the Q&A, those were we won't be responding to those. Those are the public, and so we'll just focus on questions from task force members.
We won't be responding to those. She's about to answer. She wants to answer. She's interrupted by the same woman who reminded them they have a code of conduct that they have to abide by, and they're not allowed to speak to anyone in the public or members of the press who might ask them about the task force, and they have to route those requests to the Attorney General's office. So she's about to answer the question. I'd posted multiple questions in the chat, including, is lighting a police car on fire an act of domestic violent extremism? Is taking over 6 blocks of Seattle and patrolling it with high-powered rifles an act of domestic violent extremism? And she's cut off mid-sentence by the arbitrator of who gets to talk and who doesn't, and is told we will not be answering the questions in the chat. We will only be taking questions from task force members. Task force members who are paid by us. So after that happened, immediately after, I go to write something in the chat thinking, well, that I was going to write. Well, that seems not transparent. Here's what I was met with in the chat. Questions are closed. They immediately after that closed off the Q&A section of the chat of the Zoom. So they didn't even want to see the questions. We're not going to answer them anyway, so we don't even want to see the questions. And we're supposed to believe that this is a government task force that is going to transparently evaluate domestic extremism in Washington state. When they won't let the media ask about it, won't let members of the public ask independent task force members about it, won't let their academics answer questions that are put in the chat from members of the public. And in this case, I didn't hide who it was. I said Brandi Kruse. And that's probably why they shut her down so quickly. And also, they realized I had a point. That what Bob Ferguson has said about Donald Trump being an existential threat to our country and what the President of the United States, Joe Biden, said multiple times, matches exactly the definition that that academic gave on the task force about what extremism is. And they realized that their whole grift was up, that they had been caught. This is insane. This is a complete joke. And more than that, it's dangerous. Because I already said, what's going to happen? We're all going to end up on their list. What happens when they start to identify individuals who've been engaged in their version of domestic extremism? I said at the onset of the task force, just put me on the list of extremists already. Just put me on the list because I know I'm going to end up there, and now I know I'm in good company with Bob Ferguson. Because if they put anyone else on the list, they have to put Bob Ferguson on the list because by their own definition, he's engaged in extremism. Now, I will say, Nicole sent a very lengthy email to the Attorney General's office yesterday. We realized they're in a little bit of a state of flux. We have a new Attorney General, Nick Brown, coming in, who I hope will also comment on this issue. But Bob Ferguson is still the Attorney General for 48 more hours. So Nicole sent them a very, very lengthy email. No response thus yet, my understanding. No response from them yet. A few of the questions we asked. Why can't members of the task force speak to the media or the public independently? Members were stopped from answering questions from the public. Why? There were also a couple task force members who were new this second meeting. So I want to know, did they replace people who maybe left? Because remember what I called for after the first meeting? Every member of law enforcement who is a part of that task force should resign from it immediately publicly. Half the people on there are anti-police extremists and have a clear anti-police animus. And they believe that the police and conservatives and white supremacists are more a threat of extremism in Washington state than anarchists or, God forbid, Antifa, who they'll never mention by name. One of the new members was the Walla Walla County Sheriff, which Walla Walla, areas of it are kind of this blue bastion on the east side. So it's interesting that they added a sheriff from kind of a blue area in eastern Washington to say, hey, we got a sheriff on the task force. Now, I don't know him. He's probably a perfectly nice guy, but he doesn't know jack shit about the anarchist activity that's happening in King County and about what we've been dealing with. He doesn't have any that you don't have anarchists and left-wing rioters and looters and extremists in Walla Walla. So God forbid you have a sheriff from this side of the Cascades who's actually dealt with domestic extremism from the far left. Can't have that, but you still want to check a box and say, I got a sheriff. Again, he's probably a perfectly nice guy. He should also resign from the task force effective immediately. We also asked why, if the task force continues to focus on far-right and white supremacist violence with a notable hesitancy to talk about left-wing anarchy, why anyone should take the task force seriously. And we also said some members of the task force seem to have a strong anti-police bias. And we asked if the Attorney General's office has fielded any complaints from members of law enforcement who have been part of the task force about that clear bias. So we have a lot of questions we've reached out to the Attorney General's office on. This task force is dangerous. It's one of the primary reasons or examples about why Bob Ferguson can't be trusted as governor. Bob Ferguson is very ideologically driven. And he will use things like this. He'll bend the law. He'll use task forces to try to weed out his political enemies. This is insane stuff. It's one of the craziest things I've witnessed happen under Attorney General Bob Ferguson in the 12 years he's done that job. Now we've got probably 12 or 16 years for him to be governor. He'll be governor as long as he wants to be governor. And he might be acting like a moderate now. We're going to talk about that momentarily. But he is who he has always been. And if they're not willing to shut this task force, if Nick Brown, the new Attorney General, is not willing to shut this task force down immediately for all the reasons I just articulated, then it's new boss, same as the old boss.